The morning of her wedding, Margot Ellison pressed her hand flat against the window glass and watched the fog come off the river. It was the kind of cold that had no interest in leaving. She did not cry. She had done that the night before, quietly, into a pillow she would not pack, and now she was finished with it. Her mother came in at 8:30, straightened Margot's collar. Said nothing that needed saying. The ceremony was short. The church smelled of candle wax and old wood, and the man standing beside her, Mr. Declan Ashworth, kept his eyes forward throughout. Not from nerves, she would later understand. From habit. He had learned, somewhere in the years before her, not to look at things that were going to cost him something. He shook her father's hand afterward with the particular firmness of a man completing a transaction. Then he helped her into the carriage. The gesture was not unkind. That was the part she would remember, that he was not unkind. He was simply absent in a way that had nothing to do with distance. They rode north for 4 hours. She tried once to make conversation, asked about the house. He told her it was large, old, that the east wing had been closed since his father's time. He said this the way people say things they have stopped thinking about, and then he returned to whatever was happening behind his eyes, and Margot turned to the window and watched the trees change. The house was called Grayfield. It stood at the end of a long gravel drive, and when she saw it through the carriage window, the pale stone, the dark shutters, the ivy pulled loose from the south wall like something peeling away, she did not flinch. She had been told to expect neglect. She had not been told to expect the specific kind of sadness that settles into a house when no one inside it wants to be there. He carried her trunk in himself, set it at the foot of the stairs, told her Mrs. Faber would show her the rooms. Then he said, without apology or particular warmth, that he would be leaving in the morning. Business in Philadelphia. He was not certain how long. She said, "That's fine." He looked at her then. Just for a moment, as if she had said something unexpected. He left before sunrise. Mrs. Faber was 63 years old and had been running Grayfield on a skeleton staff and a fractured budget for 2 years before Margot arrived. She showed Margot the rooms without commentary, pulling back curtains where they still hung properly, and leaving the others. The kitchen had a working range and no cook. The east wing was locked and had been locked for a long time. The library had good light in the afternoons if you sat by the south window. That first week, Margot cleaned. Not because she was expected to. No one expected anything of her, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Mrs. Faber brought her coffee at 7 each morning, and set it on whatever surface Margot was working near without being asked. And they developed in this way a friendship that required very little language. By the second week, Margot had worked her way into the library. There were ledgers on the bottom shelf. 3 of them, dark green, dated from 4 years prior to the most recent. She opened the first one out of boredom, the way you open a door in a strange house just to know what's behind it. She had grown up watching her father run his small accounting practice. She knew what ledgers were supposed to look like. These did not look like that. The numbers weren't obviously, if I'm wrong. That was the interesting thing. They were neat. Regular. The handwriting was precise. But the fees were on a schedule that made no sense for a property this size. Management costs billed quarterly by a firm called Harwick & Sons, at rates that climbed steadily, year over year in increments just small enough to avoid attention. She set the ledger on the reading table. Opened the second one. The schedule held. She opened the third. She wrote to Declan in Philadelphia, not about the ledgers, not yet. She wrote because he had left her an address and it seemed a reasonable thing to do. She told him the range was working well. That Mrs. Faber had found a woman in the village willing to come 3 days a week. That she had begun clearing the kitchen garden, which had gone entirely to seed but had good soil underneath if you got past the top layer. That she hoped his work was going well. He wrote back 11 days later. The letter was 4 sentences. The work was going well. He was glad the range was functional. He would return in 6 to 8 weeks. He hoped she was settling in. She read it standing at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it in her pocket and went back outside to the garden. She had found by then a second set of records. This one was not in the library. It was in a box at the back of a closet in what had been used as an estate office. A small room off the main hall, filled with correspondence and papers that no one had organized in years. The box was labeled simply Harwick, and inside it were invoices, receipts, and 3 letters in a handwriting she did not recognize. The letters were addressed to Declan's father. She sat on the floor of the estate office for a long time, reading. Harwick & Sons had been retained to manage the property agricultural income during the period when the elder Mr. Ashworth's health was declining. That was the stated purpose. What the letters revealed, read carefully and cross-referenced with the ledgers, was something else. The management fees bore no relationship to the work performed. The quarterly invoices were billed at a rate tied not to actual services, but to a formula buried in a contract amendment from 6 years ago. An amendment added, she noted, after the death of Declan's mother, when the house was at its most vulnerable and his father was at his least. She spent 3 days verifying, counted backward through every invoice, pulled the corresponding estate income records. Built, on 4 sheets of paper from the desk drawer, a simple table, billed versus received, quarter by quarter 6 years running. When she added the column on the right, she sat with her pen still in her hand for a long moment. $11,420, paid by the Ashworth estate to Harwick & Sons in excess of any reasonable management fee over 6 years. She put the pen down, stood, went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water. Came back and looked at the table again. The number did not change. She did not write to Declan about it immediately. She was not certain what she had the right to say. She was 3 weeks into a marriage that had not yet begun, in a house that technically belonged to her husband, having found, in that husband's papers, evidence that someone had been systematically draining his family's estate for years. The legal situation she understood. The personal one was less clear. She wrote instead to her father. He was a careful man. He wrote back in a week. Told her she was right about the numbers. Told her she should say nothing to Harwick & Sons. Told her to write everything down twice, once for herself and once to send to him, and to find out whether Declan knew. That last part was the question she had been sitting with. She thought about the ledgers, the dust on them, the way the estate office had looked, untouched, papers unread, box uncatalogued. She thought about how Declan had spoken about Greyfield in the carriage. Large, old, east wing closed since my father's time. The voice of a man who had handed something over to someone else to manage, and then deliberately not looked at it. He didn't know. She was certain of it. Declan came home at the end of the 8th week, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the light had gone the color of old bronze, and the kitchen garden had been cleared and turned and planted with a small autumn crop that Mrs. Faber had declared unnecessary, and then quietly helped tend. He came through the front door and stopped. The hall was clean. Not hotel clean, lived-in clean, the kind that requires consistent attention over time. A lamp was lit near the stairs. There were flowers on the entry table, late-season asters from the south end of the garden. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. Margot came out of the library. She was carrying a book and wearing an apron she had forgotten to take off, and she looked at him the way you look at someone you have been thinking about in their absence, carefully, to see if the reality matches the version you'd constructed. He said, "You've been busy." She said, "There wasn't much else to do." He almost smiled. She noticed it, the almost of it. She fed him dinner. Mrs. Faber had gone home for the evening, and Margot was not a trained cook, but she was a competent one in the way that women of her background were competent at most things. Quietly, without ceremony, from having watched carefully, and then simply done it. They ate at the kitchen table. He told her about Philadelphia. Not much. He was not a man who talked for the pleasure of it, but enough. She told him about the garden, about the range that had needed a new part, about Mrs. Faber's excellent opinions on the correct way to store root vegetables. He listened. That was the thing she noticed. He had the quality of a man who, when he was actually present, was entirely present. After dinner she set the papers on the table. She had organized everything. 3 months of work laid out clearly. The original contract, the amendment, the invoices, the ledgers cross-referenced, the table she had built on 4 sheets of paper, and then, on a final page, the total. She did not hand it to him. She set it in front of him and let him find his own way through it. He read without speaking. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat across from him and waited. He turned the last page, looked at the number on the right column, set the paper down. "Who knew about this?" he said. "Just my father. He helped me verify the calculation." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it. Not the numbers, he had those now, but the shape of the thing. Who had known? How long? How it had been possible? "Why didn't you write to me?" he said. She considered several answers. Settled on the true one. "I wanted to make sure I was right first." He looked at her. Not the almost smile this time. Something slower and less certain. "Is there more?" he said. She said, "I think there's a contract amendment that was signed under conditions that may not have been legally sound. My father thinks so too. I'd like you to have an attorney look at it." "Not Harwick's attorney," he said. "Of course not Harwick's attorney." She nodded. They sat with that for a moment. Then he said quietly, My father was not well at the end. I know, she said. I read the correspondence. He looked at the papers. At the table with its neat columns and the number at the bottom of the right one, he said, I should have looked at these years ago. She did not tell him he was right. It would have been true, but it was not what he needed. She said instead, you looked at them now. The attorney was a woman named Mrs. Corinne Hallett, which surprised Declan in the way that people are surprised by things they should have already known were possible. She came up from Philadelphia on a Wednesday, spent 4 hours in the estate office with Margot and Declan and the papers, and left with a copy of everything and a list of questions for Harwick and Sons that she described, without drama, as substantial. Harwick and Sons responded with a letter suggesting the matter had been a clerical error. Mrs. Hallett wrote back a letter that was 3 pages long and contained the phrase fraudulent misrepresentation twice and breach of fiduciary duty once. Margot read the draft in the estate office. She did not cheer or otherwise perform satisfaction. She made one small suggestion about the phrasing in the second paragraph, which Mrs. Hallett considered and then adopted, and they shook hands, and the letter went out. It took 5 months to resolve. Harwick and Sons settled before it reached a court. The amount recovered was $9,000, which was not the full $11,000 but was, Mrs. Hallett explained, the number they could prove without dispute. The principal of the firm, a man named Gerald Harwick, 61 years old, who had grown up knowing the Ashworth family and had been trusted accordingly, did not contest it publicly. He simply paid. Declan came to find Margot when the check arrived. She was in the library, which was where she spent most of her mornings now. He held out the letter. She read it. 9,000, she said. It's not all of it. No, she said. But it's something. He sat down across from her. It was the chair she had come to think of as his, not because he used it often, but because when he was home and in the library, that was where he sat. Why did you do all of this? He said. She looked at him. It was my house too, she said. By that point, he was quiet. She thought he might leave it there. He had a tendency to do that, to let a statement stand without pressing on it, which was a quality she had come to find restful. But is it, still? Do you think of it that way? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Yes, she said. I think I do. He looked at her for a long moment. She held it. He said, I owe you an apology. She said, for which part? He almost laughed. Not quite. Almost. For leaving, he said. On the first morning, that was. I handled that poorly. She thought about the carriage ride, the 4 sentences in his letter, the 8 weeks. She said, why did you? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, my first engagement ended 3 years ago. The week before the wedding, she chose someone else. I handled that badly. For a long time. And then your father and my father had already made the arrangement. And by the time I came back to myself enough to think clearly, there didn't seem to be a way out of it that didn't hurt you more than going through with it. Margot set her book down. So you married me anyway, she said. He said, I thought I could keep my distance. That it would be manageable. She waited. And then I came home, he said, and the house was lit, and you'd been here for 8 weeks doing something I should have done years ago, and I. He stopped, she said, gently, and? He looked at his hands. Then, at her. It's harder to keep distance from someone who is already making herself at home, he said. She thought about the kitchen garden, the ledgers, the letters she had written and his 4 sentences back, and the way she had folded his letter and put it in her pocket anyway. She said, I wasn't trying to make it harder for you. I know, he said. That's the part that makes it harder. Spring came slowly to Grayfield, the way it always did in the northern counties, grudging, with frost still in the mornings well into April. But the kitchen garden came up. Not everything she'd planted, but most of it. The east wing stayed closed through winter, but in March, Declan unlocked it. He didn't make an announcement. He simply appeared one morning with the key, and asked if she wanted to see what they were working with. They stood together in the cold of the unused rooms, and she catalogued what could be salvaged and what couldn't. She had a notebook. He had a lamp. The room smelled of closed-up time and old curtains, and they went through them one by one, her taking notes, him answering questions when she had them. At the last room he paused. It was a smaller one, at the north end. Better light than the others, she noted. A window seat. My mother used this room, he said. He said it without drama, but he said it. She made a note. Then she looked at the window seat and the light and said, it's a good room. He looked at her. He said, yes, it is. Mrs. Hallett came back in May on an unrelated matter, a property question Declan needed answered, and stayed for dinner. She and Margot spent an hour after dinner at the kitchen table going over the estate accounts, because by then Margot had taken over managing them formally, which had happened without either of them saying so directly. Declan had simply begun setting papers on her desk. She had simply begun dealing with them. At one point Margot looked up and said, "To Mrs. Hallett, do you take on associates?" Mrs. Hallett looked at her for a long moment. She said, "What kind of work are you interested in?" Margot said, "Estate law, fiduciary matters. The kind of thing that requires being good with numbers and willing to ask inconvenient questions." Mrs. Hallett smiled. The kind of smile that has something real behind it, she said, "I'll think about it." She thought about it for 9 days and then wrote to say yes. The letter from Harwick and Sons came in June. Not from Gerald Harwick. From his son, who had taken over the firm after the settlement. It was brief and apologetic and stated that the firm had reviewed its practices and was implementing new oversight protocols. It was the sort of letter that people write when they have been caught and want to be seen doing better. Declan gave it to Margot without comment. She read it at the library table. She said, "He's trying." Declan said, "He should be." She set the letter down. Outside the south window, the garden had gone fully green. The kitchen garden was productive enough that they'd begun giving the surplus to Mrs. Faber to take home. The east wing was half open now, the rooms being aired one by one. She thought about the morning she had arrived. The fog off the river before the wedding. The way the house had looked through the carriage window. The way he had said, "Large, old, east wing closed since my father's time." He was standing in the doorway now, watching her. She said, without turning, "Come and look at the garden." He came and stood beside her at the window. It had taken most of a year. The roses they'd planted along the south wall were still thin, still learning their way up the trellis, not much to look at yet, but they were there, alive and holding. She did not say anything, neither did he. They stood together in the good light of the south window, and the house was quiet around them in the way a house is quiet when everyone in it is exactly where they mean to be, and that was enough. It was more than enough, for now.